The truth of what her grandfather had left her was not in his will, but in the wheezing, broken-down accordion he'd insisted she take, an instrument whose silent bellows concealed a fortune in stolen diamonds worth over $267 million. If you love stories about hidden legacies and the secrets that bind families together, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from in the world. The lawyer, a man named Alastair Finch whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disappointment, had cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sterile, wood-paneled office. Alara's siblings, Liam and Chloe, shifted in their leather chairs, their impatience a palpable force in the room, a low hum of expensive watches and restless ambition. They had already received their inheritance, neat, clean portfolios of stocks and the deed to a small but profitable commercial property downtown. It was all predictable, all sensible. Then came Alara's turn. Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles and read from the document in a dry monotone. To my granddaughter Alara, who always understood that a story is worth more than a stock certificate, I leave my oldest companion, my Galanti accordion, and the music it still holds. A choked sound, half laugh, half scoff, escaped Chloe's lips. Liam just shook his head, a slow, pitying motion that was far more insulting than any overt laugh. He looked at Alara, his eyes a mixture of condescension and genuine confusion. An accordion, Alara? A broken one at that. What are you supposed to do with that? Chloe leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping a sharp rhythm on the polished mahogany table. Dad always said Grandpa was losing it at the end. I guess this proves it. He leaves us assets, and he leaves you. A dusty box of noise. Alara said nothing. She felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the sting of being perpetually misunderstood by the two people who should have known her best. She didn't look at them. Instead, she looked at the instrument case resting against the wall. It was old, the black leather scuffed and cracked at the seams, the metal latches tarnished with age. It looked like a small, forgotten coffin. She remembered her grandfather, Dominic, playing it on the porch of his small house, his eyes closed, his foot tapping out a rhythm only he could hear. The music was often mournful, a cascade of minor keys that spoke of a place she'd never seen, a life he'd never fully shared. To Liam and Chloe, it was junk, a sentimental relic. To Alara, it was the last tangible piece of him. "I'll take it," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through their derision. Mr. Finch gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of something that might have been respect. The drive home was a blur of gray cityscapes and the oppressive weight of her siblings' judgment. They had insisted on helping her, which meant Liam drove her cramped sedan, while Chloe critiqued her life choices from the passenger seat. The accordion case took up the entire back seat, a silent, hulking passenger. "You could have contested it, you know," Liam said, his gaze fixed on the road. "It's clearly an unequal distribution. Finch would have backed you up. It's insulting. It's what he wanted," Alara murmured, staring out the window at the rain-streaked glass. "He wanted to saddle you with his garbage?" Chloe countered, twisting to look at her. "Honestly, Alara, you work in a library archive for pennies, surrounded by dead people's letters. You can't afford this kind of sentimentality. That thing is probably full of mold. You should just throw it out." The thought was like a physical blow. Throw it out, as if it were nothing more than a broken appliance, as if the memories attached to it had no value. By the time they reached her small, third-floor apartment, the rain was coming down in earnest. Liam carried the case up the narrow stairs, his grunts of effort echoing in the stairwell. He set it down in the middle of her living room with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the floorboards. The case dominated the small space, an artifact from another world. "Well," Liam said, wiping his hands on his trousers, "there you go. Your inheritance." They didn't stay long. They had a dinner reservation at a restaurant Alara could never afford, a place with white tablecloths and whispering waiters. They left her standing in the silence of her apartment, the sound of the rain against the window the only reply to their hurried goodbyes. For a long time she just stood there, looking at the case. It smelled of her grandfather's house, of old wood, pipe tobacco, and something else, something faintly metallic and earthy, like damp soil. It was the smell of the past. Finally, she knelt down and ran her hand over the worn leather. The latches were stiff, but they clicked open with a satisfying finality. She lifted the lid. The accordion rested inside on a bed of faded red velvet. It was even more worn than she remembered. The mother-of-pearl keys were yellowed and chipped, and a long crack ran across the glossy black finish of one side. The bellows, the folded heart of the instrument, were creased and looked brittle, a tear visible near the bottom seam. It was, by all practical measures, worthless. Chloe was right. It was broken. And yet, as Alara looked at it, she felt a profound sense of connection. This was the vessel of his stories, the source of the melodies that had been the soundtrack to her childhood visits. She reached out, her fingers tracing the intricate grill work over the reeds. As she gently lifted the instrument from its case, she noticed something, a subtle imbalance. It was heavier on the bellows side than it should have been, a dead, unyielding weight that had nothing to do with the mechanics of keys and reeds. She set it down carefully on her rug and pushed gently on the bellows. They wouldn't compress. They were stiff, stuck. A faint, dry, rattling sound came from within, like a handful of pebbles being shaken in a cardboard box. Her siblings saw a broken object, piece of junk. But Alara, the archivist, the keeper of forgotten things, saw a container, a vessel. And for the first time, she wondered what kind of music, what kind of story, was truly locked inside. The weight of it felt less like memory and more like a secret. The days that followed the reading of the will settled into a new, strange rhythm for Alara. Her life, once a predictable current of quiet work and solitary evenings, now eddied around the immense, silent presence of the accordion in her living room. It sat on the floor, still nestled in its velvet-lined case, a dark monolith of memory and mystery. At the library, she moved through the hushed stacks, the scent of aging paper and binding glue a familiar comfort. She handled brittle manuscripts and digitized faded photographs, her work a constant, gentle communion with the past. But now, the stories she preserved for others felt distant, less urgent than the one waiting for her at home. Her mind would drift. While cataloging a collection of a 19th-century botanist's field notes, she found herself thinking about the accordion's weight, the specific, dense, and unnatural gravity of it. It was a problem her logical, ordered mind couldn't shelve. It was an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the known schematics of the object. Her siblings called, their voices tinny and remote through the phone. Liam called to talk about the stock market, about capital gains and dividends, his words a foreign language she had no desire to learn. "Are you sure you don't want me to talk to Finch?" he'd asked again, his tone dripping with the exasperation of a man trying to help someone who refused to be helped. "It's not too late. We can argue diminished capacity. I'm fine, Liam," she'd said, her voice flatter than she intended. "I'm happy with what he left me," a heavy sigh on his end. "Happy with a broken musical instrument. Alara, when are you going to start thinking about your future?" Chloe's calls were worse. They were sharp, surgical strikes at Alara's life choices. "I saw the cutest little condo for sale a few blocks from me," she'd said, not asking but telling. "With our inheritance, Liam and I could help you with a down payment. You can't live in that tiny apartment forever. You could sell that thing for a few bucks at a pawn shop. At least get something for it, sell it." The word felt like a betrayal. Every time they spoke, the gulf between their worlds widened. They saw life as a series of acquisitions, a ladder to be climbed. Alara saw it as a collection of stories to be understood. They wanted to build a future out of new materials. She felt compelled to understand the foundation she was built upon. One evening, after a particularly grating call with Chloe, Alara found herself kneeling before the accordion again. The rain had returned, a soft, persistent drumming against her window pane that seemed to sync with the anxious thrumming in her chest. She ran her fingers over the cracked finish, the yellowed keys. She thought of her grandfather's hands, large and calloused from a life of labor she knew little about, moving over these same keys with a surprising grace. He was a stonemason by trade, a man who worked with his hands, shaping hard, unforgiving materials. Why an accordion? It seemed such a contrast, the brute force of stone and the delicate, airy melancholy of the instrument's music. She decided she would try to fix it. Not to play it necessarily, but to understand it. To honor the gift by tending to it. Her archivist instincts kicked in. She began with research. Tucked away in a small pocket inside the case, she found a tarnished metal plate. Galanti Fratelli, Mondano, Italia. A quick search on her laptop opened a small window into the past. The Galanti brothers were renowned accordion makers from a small town in Italy. Their instruments were known for their rich tone and robust construction. She found forums of accordion enthusiasts, old men with names like Accordional and Squeezeboxal, who debated the merits of different reed blocks and bass mechanisms. She posted a photo of her grandfather's instrument. The responses came quickly. It was a pre-war model, they said. Rare. A collector's item, perhaps, if it were in good condition. One comment stood out. A user named Old World Sounds wrote, "That model, the Super Dominator, was famous for its custom builds. Sometimes they had reinforced bellows for durability. But that can make them heavy. Be careful if you try to open the bellows assembly yourself. The gaskets are fragile, reinforced bellows." The phrase snagged in her mind. Could explain the weight. But the rattling, that didn't fit. It wasn't the sound of machinery. It was the sound of something loose, something small and hard and numerous. Her curiosity now fully ignited, she moved from digital research to physical examination. She laid the accordion on a soft blanket and, with a set of jeweler's screwdrivers she used for repairing old bookbindings, she began to explore its architecture. She was careful, her movements precise and patient. She removed the grill, revealing the intricate rows of reeds, tiny metal tongues that vibrated to create the sound. Everything seemed normal, if a little dusty. She examined the bass side, the complex machine of buttons and levers. Nothing seemed out of place. That left the bellows. They were the lungs of the instrument, the source of its breath. They were also the source of the strange weight and the rattling sound. She inspected the tear near the bottom. It was small, but large enough to peer into with a penlight. She angled the light into the dark, musty interior, the smell of old leather and glue filling her nostrils. She saw nothing but the dark, folded paper and leather of the opposing side. But when she shook it again, gently, the rattling was clearly coming from deep within the folds, from a space that shouldn't exist. According to the diagrams she'd studied online, the bellows were supposed to be an open, empty chamber to move air. There was nowhere for anything to be trapped. Unless, as Old World Sounds had hinted, it was a custom build. Unless there was a hidden compartment, a false wall inside the very lungs of the instrument. The idea seemed preposterous, something out of a spy novel. But her grandfather had been a quiet man, a man with a sad, distant look in his eyes whenever the old country was mentioned. He had escaped Italy during the war, a story he never told in detail, only in fragments of loss and hardship. He was a man who knew how to keep secrets. The accordion wasn't just an instrument. It was a piece of him, a piece of his untold story. And Alara, the keeper of stories, felt an overwhelming conviction that she was on the verge of reading its most hidden, most important chapter. The challenge was no longer just about repair. It was about revelation. The decision to seek help did not come easily. Alara was a private person, accustomed to solving problems on her own within the quiet confines of her apartment or the library archives. But the accordion was a puzzle box far beyond her expertise. The delicate mechanics, the strange, unyielding weight, the tantalizing rattle from within its core. It was a lock she didn't have the key for. Her online research led her to a name whispered with reverence on the accordion forums. Abram Petrov. He ran a small, cluttered shop in a part of the city that time seemed to have forgotten, a neighborhood of cobblestone alleys and old brick buildings. The shop was called The Music Box, a deceptively simple name for a place that was rumored to be part workshop, part museum, part sanctuary for instruments with storied pasts. Finding it felt like a quest in itself. She carried the heavy case through the bustling city, the weight a constant reminder of the mystery it held. The shop was tucked away on a narrow side street, its facade faded, the gold lettering on the window barely legible. A small brass bell tinkled as she pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was thick with the scent of rosin, old wood, and soldering flux. Instruments in various states of repair hung from the ceiling and lined the walls. Violins with their bellies open, a grand piano stripped of its keys, the brass tubing of a French horn gleaming under a bare bulb. In the center of the beautiful chaos stood a man who looked as old and timeless as his surroundings. He was slight, with a wild halo of white hair and a long, stained leather apron. His eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, were a startlingly bright blue. He looked up from the delicate inner workings of a cello he was tending to, and his gaze was not just curious, but deeply knowing. "I do not get many of these anymore," he said, his voice a low rumble with a thick Eastern European accent. He hadn't even looked at the case, but he seemed to know. "Let me see it." Elara hefted the case onto his main workbench, a massive slab of scarred wood that looked like it had borne the weight of 1,000 musical secrets. She opened it, the red velvet interior looking tired under the workshop's harsh light. Mr. Abram leaned over the accordion, not touching it at first, just observing. His eyes scanned every inch of it, from the yellowed keys to the cracked finish to the tarnished chrome. He was like a doctor assessing a patient, his expression one of intense concentration. "Galanti, pre-war," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A good machine." Strong voice. He finally reached out a hand, his fingers surprisingly nimble and steady, and pressed on one of the bass buttons. He then gently tried to work the bellows. They remained stubbornly stiff. "Ah," he said, a single syllable that held a world of understanding. "She does not breathe." He picked up the entire instrument, his frail-looking arms handling the weight with unpracticed ease. He held it for a moment, his eyes closed, as if listening to it, or perhaps weighing it in a way that had nothing to do with pounds and ounces. He shook it gently, just as Elara had done. The dry rattle was audible in the quiet shop. His eyes opened, and he looked at Elara over the top of his glasses. "This is not the sound of a broken reed. This is the sound of a secret." Elara felt a shiver run down her spine. He saw it too. He understood. "My grandfather left it to me," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. "He never spoke much about his past. He came from Italy during the war." Mr. Abram nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the accordion. "The war," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "Many things were carried in strange containers during the war. Memories, hopes, and sometimes other things. Things that needed to be hidden." He laid the instrument back on the workbench and began a more thorough examination. He used a small mirror and a light to peer into the grill, tapped gently on the casing with his knuckles, listening to the resonance. His movements were economical and precise, the result of a lifetime of intimate conversation with wood, metal, and wire. He spent a long time focused on the bellows. He ran his fingers along every fold, every seam. "The construction is not standard," he said at last, pointing to a section near the bottom plate. "The leather here, it is thicker, and this seam, it is sewn from the inside. A factory would not do this. This is the work of a man hiding something." He took a small, thin metal probe and carefully inserted it into the tear Elara had found. He moved it around, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, it hit something solid with a faint clink. It was not the soft wall of the opposite bellows. It was something hard, something that shouldn't be there. "There is a false bottom," he declared, withdrawing the probe, "or a false wall. Inside the bellows themselves, a hidden chamber. Your grandfather was a very clever man. Or a very desperate one. Can you open it?" Elara asked, her heart pounding. Mr. Abrams straightened up and looked at her, his bright blue eyes serious. "I can. It would mean cutting the bellows. They would need to be completely replaced. It is a big job. Expensive." He paused, cleaning his glasses on his apron. "But before I do that, you must ask yourself a question. Some secrets are kept for a reason." Are you certain you wish to know this one? Once a story is told, it cannot be untold. It becomes your story to carry. His words hung in the air, heavier than the accordion itself. He was offering her a choice: to leave the past undisturbed, to let the secret lie dormant, or to cut it open and face whatever came spilling out. Her siblings' voices echoed in her mind. Throw it out. Sell it. It's junk. They saw an object. Mr. Abrams saw a story. And Alara, standing in the cluttered, timeless workshop, knew what she was. She was a keeper of stories. I need to know, she said, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised her. I need to know his story. Mr. Abram gave a slow, solemn nod. Very well. Leave it with me. Come back in 1 week. And be prepared. Some things are heavier than they look. He had unknowingly echoed a phrase her grandfather used to say, a simple proverb that now felt like a profound and deliberate warning. The week that followed was the longest of Alara's life. The silence in her apartment was no longer peaceful. It was hollow. The empty space on her living room floor where the accordion had been was a constant, glaring reminder of the secret being surgically extracted from its heart. Sleep offered little respite. Her dreams were filled with the sound of wheezing bellows and the dry, rattling sound of unknown things. She dreamt of her grandfather, not as the gentle old man she knew, but as a younger man, his face taut with fear, running through dark, unfamiliar streets, clutching the heavy accordion to his chest as if it were a shield. She would wake with a start, the scent of dust and old leather phantom in the air. At work, her concentration was shattered. The quiet hum of the library's climate control system seemed to whisper questions she couldn't answer. Who was her grandfather? What had he done? What had he been running from? The simple, sepia-toned image she had of him was beginning to crack, revealing a far more complex and shadowed portrait beneath. She tried to lose herself in her work, but every historical document she touched seemed to mock her with its own revealed secrets. A soldier's letter from the front lines, a family's diary detailing their flight from a war-torn city. These were stories she could catalog, label, and file away. Her own family's story, however, was a living, breathing mystery that was about to be pried open on a stranger's workbench. Liam called again, his voice sharp with frustration. I spoke to a financial advisor, Alara. He said Grandpa's portfolio for us was conservative. Fine. But if you'd just let me help you make a case, we could leverage your part of the inheritance for something real. A down payment. An investment. Anything is better than a broken box of wood and buttons. It's not just a box, Liam, she said, her voice tight. It's complicated. Complicated? It's a 100-year-old piece of junk. What's complicated about that? She couldn't tell him. She couldn't say, I think our grandfather, the quiet stonemason, might have been a smuggler or a thief or something else entirely. How could she voice a suspicion that felt so immense, so world-altering without any proof? The week crawled by agonizing hour. On the appointed day, she walked back to the music box, her steps feeling both heavy and hurried. The city seemed too loud, too bright, a stark contrast to the shadowy alley where Mr. Abrams' shop resided. The bell above the door chimed, the sound now familiar, almost ominous. Mr. Abram was standing at his workbench, his back to her. The accordion was there, but it was in pieces. The keyboard and bass mechanism were separated from the central bellows, which lay on a clean white cloth like a patient in an operating theater. One side of the bellows had been carefully sliced open along a seam, the folded paper and leather peeled back. Mr. Abram turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of awe and deep solemnity. He didn't speak. He simply gestured for her to come closer. Alara approached the bench, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at the exposed interior of the bellows. And then she saw it. It wasn't just a hidden chamber. The entire structure of the bellows had been a lie. Between the thin outer layers of leather and paper that moved the air was a second, sealed interior wall. And inside that space, packed tightly in small, oilcloth pouches and yellowing cotton batting, lay a breathtaking, impossible sight. Diamonds. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were not the perfectly cut, glittering jewels of a modern display case. These were old-world cuts, rougher, deeper, with a fire that seemed to come from within. They ranged in size from small, brilliant chips to stones as large as the tip of her thumb. They filled the entire cavity of the Bellows, a secret treasure hoard that pulsed with a cold, ancient light under the single bare bulb of the workshop. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. She reached out a trembling hand but stopped just short of touching them, as if they might burn her. The sheer, overwhelming reality of it was too much to process. The weight, the rattling. It hadn't been pebbles. It had been this, a king's ransom, hidden in the lungs of a poor immigrant's musical instrument. "I have seen many things in my life," Mr. Abrams said, his voice a low, hushed whisper that barely disturbed the silence. "But never this." Never. He reached into the compartment and picked up one of the small oilcloth pouches. It was brittle with age. He carefully untied the string that held it closed and tipped its contents into his palm. A cascade of smaller diamonds spilled out, glittering like a handful of captured stars. "They are not all the same," he observed, his voice regaining some of its professional tone. "Different cuts, different qualities. This is not one collection. This is many." Assembled, Alara finally found her voice, a choked, disbelieving whisper. "How? How much is the easier question," Mr. Abrams said, his eyes still fixed on the stones in his hand. "A quick appraisal is impossible. But the quality, the sheer volume, this is not thousands of dollars. It is millions. Many, many millions." He let the diamonds trickle back into the pouch. As he did, a small, folded piece of paper that had been tucked inside fell onto the white cloth. It was old, the creases so deep they were almost tears. Alara picked it up with shaking fingers. Her archivist's hands, so used to handling delicate documents, felt clumsy and numb. She carefully unfolded it. Inside was a list of names. Not Italian names, but German, Polish, Dutch. Beside each name was a brief description. Levi, jeweler, Amsterdam, Rosenberg, family, Warsaw, Becker, collection, Berlin. Below the list, in her grandfather's familiar, spidery script, were 3 words. "Forgive me." Remember them. The world tilted on its axis. The glittering stones on the table suddenly lost their luster. They were no longer a treasure. They were a testament. Each one represented a name on that list, a life appended, a story silenced by the war. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden of immense, crushing weight. Her grandfather hadn't been a thief. He had been a keeper, a ferryman of stolen legacies. And the fortune that now lay before her was not a gift to be spent, but a debt to be repaid. The silence in the workshop was absolute, broken only by the sound of Alara's own ragged breathing as she stared at the list, the names of ghosts written in her grandfather's hand. The walk home from Mr. Abrams' shop was a disorienting journey through a world that no longer looked the same. The city's familiar landscape, the bustling crowds, the rumbling traffic, the towering buildings, seemed like a flimsy stage set, a distraction from the profound, heavy reality she now carried. She had refused Mr. Abrams' offer to keep the diamonds in his safe, feeling an irrational, fierce need to have them with her. He had helped her transfer them from the ruined Bellows into a series of canvas bank bags he kept in his back room. They were astonishingly heavy. The worn straps of the duffel bag, she carried them in cut deeply into her shoulder, a physical manifestation of the moral weight that was settling upon her soul. Back in her apartment, she locked the door, slid the chain across, and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The space that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage, too small and fragile to contain the secret it now held. She emptied the canvas bags onto the floor, the diamonds spilling out onto her worn rug in a glittering, silent tide. They caught the dim light of her single-floor lamp, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was a sight of obscene beauty, a dragon's hoard in a librarian's hovel. $267 million. That was the number Mr. Abram had cautiously estimated after a more thorough look. A number so vast it was abstract, meaningless. It was a figure she might read in a newspaper article about a corporate merger or a nation's budget, not one that was currently piled on her floor. For a terrifying moment, the temptation was a physical presence in the room. She saw her life transformed. No more worrying about rent. No more living paycheck to paycheck. She could buy a beautiful house, travel the world, never work another day in her life. She could give Liam and Chloe each a fortune that would make their stock portfolios look like pocket change. She saw their shocked, envious faces, and a small, ugly part of her savored the thought. But then her eyes fell on the small, folded piece of paper she had placed on her coffee table. The list of names. Levi, Rosenberg, Becker. Ghosts. Their faces stared back at her from the depths of the glittering stones. This wasn't her money. It was theirs. It was their stolen past, their liquidated lives. The words her grandfather had written burned in her mind. Forgive me. Remember them. He wasn't asking for forgiveness for stealing. He was asking for forgiveness for what he had been unable to do, to return what he had saved. He had carried this burden across an ocean and through a lifetime, the secret sealed within the music he played. He hadn't been able to finish the story, and now he had passed the telling of it to her, the keeper of stories. A profound, bone-deep paranoia began to set in. Every creak of the old building's floorboards, every siren in the distance, every footstep in the hallway outside her door sounded like a threat. Who knew about this? Had her grandfather told anyone? Had anyone been looking for this fortune all these years? The accordion had been his constant companion. What if someone had known or suspected what it carried? She hastily gathered the diamonds, her hands shaking, and stuffed them back into the canvas bags. She needed to hide them, but where? Her small apartment offered few options. Under the bed? Too obvious. In a closet? Too easy to find. She looked around, her eyes darting from one piece of furniture to another. Her gaze landed on her bookshelves, filled with the one thing she valued most in the world: stories. She pulled out an armful of thick, hardcover art history books from a bottom shelf, their pages filled with the very kind of beauty that had been stolen from the people on her grandfather's list. She placed the heavy canvas bags in the empty space and slid the books back in front of them. It was a flimsy hiding place, but it felt right. Hiding a stolen fortune behind the documented history of what is beautiful and what is lost. For the next few days, she lived in a state of suspended animation, a ghost in her own life. She went to work, performing her duties with robotic precision, her mind 1,000 miles away. Her colleagues noticed the change. "Are you all right, Alara?" Her supervisor, a kind older woman named Margaret, asked. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," she lied, the words tasting like ash. Just a family matter. The greatest challenge was feigning normalcy with her siblings. Chloe called, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Liam and I closed on the downtown property. The tenants are already paying. It's a cash flow machine. We were thinking, maybe we could all go out to celebrate? To that new French place." Alara felt a wave of nausea. Cash flow machine. Assets. Her grandfather's legacy was a list of murdered families, and theirs was a rental income. The chasm between their realities was now an impassable canyon. "I can't," she said, her voice strained. "I'm not feeling well." "You're always not feeling well lately," Chloe said, her tone shifting from bubbly to accusatory. "What is wrong with you? Is it about the will? Are you still upset about that stupid accordion?" "No," Alara said quickly. "I have to go." She hung up before Chloe could reply, her hand trembling. The lie was a constant effort. How long could she maintain it? The list of names became her obsession. She took it to work, hiding it in her desk drawer. During her lunch breaks, she would retreat to the deepest, most secure part of the archive, the rare documents room, and begin her search. As an archivist, she had access to databases and historical records the general public didn't even know existed. She started with the first name. Levi, jeweler, Amsterdam. She cross-referenced the name with wartime records, deportation lists, and survivor registries. The search was painstaking, a slow, methodical descent into the darkest chapter of modern history. After hours of searching, she found him. Jacob Levi, a renowned diamond cutter from Amsterdam, owner of a small but highly respected shop. His entire family, a wife and 2 young daughters, had been arrested in 1943. They were sent to Auschwitz. None of them survived. The record included a grainy, black-and-white photograph of the family, taken a year before their arrest. They were smiling. The 2 little girls had ribbons in their hair. Alara stared at the photo, her vision blurring with tears. These were the faces behind the diamonds. This was the weight in the duffel bag. It wasn't just a fortune. It was a memorial. She had to find the others. She had to know their stories. The diamonds were no longer a source of temptation or fear. They were a sacred trust. Her mission was clear. It wasn't to hide the fortune or to spend it. It was to unravel the story her grandfather had died with, and to finally, after more than 70 years, give it an ending. The archive became Alara's sanctuary and her laboratory. The quiet, climate-controlled rooms, once just a place of employment, transformed into the epicenter of her secret, all-consuming mission. She pored over Holocaust survivor testimonies, property confiscation records from the Nazi regime, and genealogical databases, tracing the faint, faded threads of the lives listed on her grandfather's note. Each name was a ghost she was determined to give substance to. Rosenberg, family, Warsaw. She found them after 3 days of relentless searching. They were a family of academics. Their apartment in Warsaw said to have been lined with books from floor to ceiling. They had managed to convert their assets into diamonds before the ghetto was sealed, hoping to bribe their way to safety. The records showed they were betrayed. Their story ended in Treblinka. She found a single surviving photograph of the father, a man with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression, holding his young son on his shoulders. The boy was laughing. Becker, Collection, Berlin. This was a harder trail to follow. The Beckers were not Jewish. They were political dissidents who had been part of an underground resistance movement. They were also art dealers who had used their connections to help families smuggle their valuables out of Germany. The collection was not their own, but a consolidated cache of assets belonging to dozens of families they had tried to save. The Gestapo had raided their gallery in 1944. Mr. and Mrs. Becker were executed. There were no known survivors. With each discovery, the diamonds hidden behind her books grew heavier. They were no longer individual stones but a mosaic of tragedy, a condensed archive of stolen futures. Her grandfather, Dominic, began to emerge from the shadows of her memory not as a simple stonemason, but as a far more complex figure. How had he come to possess these? Was he a member of the resistance like the Beckers? A courier? A man who had found himself in the right place at the wrong time, or perhaps the worst possible time. She found his immigration records. Dominic Gallo arrived in New York in 1947. He had listed his profession as musician. There was no mention of stonemasonry. He had come with nothing but the clothes on his back and one musical instrument case. The accordion. It had been his vessel, his passport, his secret vault. He had carried the weight of all those lives across the ocean, and then for the rest of his life. The mournful music he played now made a terrible, beautiful sense. He wasn't just playing notes. He was weeping for the ghosts he carried. As her investigation deepened, her isolation grew. She avoided her siblings' calls, responding only with brief, non-committal texts. Her life outside the archive and her apartment had effectively ceased to exist. She grew thin, her eyes shadowed with lack of sleep. Her world had shrunk to a single burning point of focus: the list. One evening, there was a sharp, insistent knock on her door. It wasn't the gentle tap of a neighbor or the thud of a delivery. It was hard, official. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her mind racing. Had someone found out? Was this it? She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Liam and Chloe. Their faces were grim, etched with a mixture of anger and concern. She had no choice but to let them in. They stormed into her apartment, their presence overwhelming the small space. Chloe's eyes immediately began scanning the room, as if looking for evidence of a crime. Liam stood with his arms crossed, his expression like a thundercloud. "What is going on, Alara?" he demanded, his voice low and tight. "You don't answer your phone. You're avoiding us. People at the library say you look like a ghost. What is it?" "I've just been busy," she mumbled, clutching her robe tighter around herself. It was a pathetic defense, and they saw right through it. "Busy?" Chloe scoffed, her gaze landing on the stacks of historical research papers on Alara's small dining table. "Busy with what?" "More of this dusty nonsense." She picked up a printout of the Rosenberg family records. "Who are these people?" "It's for a project at work," Alara lied, snatching the paper from her hand. Her defensiveness only fueled their suspicion. "Don't lie to us," Liam said, his voice rising. "We're your family. We're worried about you. Ever since the will, you've been acting strange. Secretive. Did you find something? Did Grandpa leave some cash hidden in that old house that we missed?" The question hung in the air, dangerously close to the truth. They smelled money. Their instincts, honed by a lifetime of ambition, had picked up the scent. "No," Alara said, her voice shaking slightly. "There's no money." Chloe took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. She looked different now. The sisterly concern had vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glint. "I don't believe you," she said softly. "You're a terrible liar, Alara. You always have been. You found something in that accordion, didn't you? That's why you're obsessed with it." Alara's silence was its own confession. Liam's posture changed. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, his expression now one of intense, predatory curiosity. "How much, Alara?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A few thousand? Some old gold coins? Whatever it is, it belongs to the estate. To all of us, they saw it. They saw the secret in her eyes, but they were interpreting it through their own lens of greed. They imagined a small, hidden windfall, a secret stash of grandfather's savings. They had no concept, no possible frame of reference for the scale of the truth. "There is nothing for you," Alara said, a new strength entering her voice. It wasn't her secret to share, and it certainly wasn't their money to claim. "It's not what you think." "Then tell us what it is," Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. "Stop treating us like we're the enemy." "You should go," Alara said, walking to the door and holding it open. "I have work to do." Liam stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "This isn't over, Alara," he said, his voice cold. "We'll find out what you're hiding." They left, slamming the door behind them. The sound echoed in the silent apartment. Alara slid the chain back into place, her back pressed against the door, her body trembling not with fear, but with a strange, resolute anger. They weren't just a nuisance anymore. They were a threat. Their greed, once a simple character flaw, was now a direct danger to the memory of Jacob Levi, the Rosenberg family, and the Beckers. They wouldn't understand the list. They would only see the glitter. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would not let it go. The battle for her grandfather's legacy was no longer just a historical investigation. It had become a war within her own family. The confrontation with her siblings left Alara profoundly shaken, but also strangely fortified. Their raw, undisguised avarice had clarified her purpose. This was a test, and she could not fail. The memory of the people on her grandfather's list depended on her. She redoubled her efforts, working with a feverish intensity. She knew Liam and Chloe would not give up. Their threat, "We'll find out what you're hiding," was not an idle one. She had to move faster. Her research led her to a new kind of institution, organizations dedicated to tracing the heirs of Holocaust victims and recovering stolen assets. She spent hours on their websites, reading about their painstaking work, the decades-long searches for a single living relative, the legal battles to reclaim art and property. This was a world of forensic genealogy, of international law, of profound moral justice. It was here she realized that the answer lay. She couldn't do this alone. She needed experts, allies who understood the labyrinthine complexity of her task. After much deliberation, She chose one. The Inheritance Reclamation Project, a nonprofit based in Geneva known for its tenacity and its deep respect for the families it served. Making the call was one of the most difficult things she had ever done. It meant sharing the secret, letting it out of the confines of her apartment and Mr. Abrams' shop. It meant trusting strangers with a story that felt intimately hers. She dialed the number with a trembling hand. A calm, professional voice answered. Inheritance Reclamation Project. How may I help you? Alara took a deep breath. My name is Alara Gallo, she began, her voice unsteady. I believe I am in possession of assets that belong to victims of the Holocaust. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not of disbelief but of profound practiced gravity. Can you tell me more, Ms. Gallo? And so, she told them. She told them everything. The will, the accordion, the strange weight, Mr. Abrams' discovery, the diamonds, and finally, the list of names. She read the names aloud, her voice cracking with emotion. It was the first time she had spoken them to anyone. Saying them out loud gave them a new power, a new reality. The woman on the phone, who introduced herself as Dr. Anya Schmidt, listened without interruption. Her silence was not empty. It was attentive, respectful. When Alara finished, Dr. Schmidt's voice was gentle but firm. Ms. Gallo, what you have done, the research you have undertaken, it is extraordinary. You have carried this burden with immense integrity. We can help you. The relief that washed over Alara was so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She was no longer alone. The process began immediately. Dr. Schmidt arranged for a secure, bonded courier to come to Alara's apartment. Two stern-faced security professionals, a man and a woman dressed in plain clothes, arrived the next day. They watched as Alara, her hands shaking, removed the art books and pulled out the heavy canvas bags. They inventoried the contents with quiet efficiency, their faces betraying no emotion at the sight of the fortune spread across her floor. Each diamond was documented, weighed, and sealed in a tamper-proof container. The entire collection was then placed in a reinforced steel case. They also took her grandfather's note, handling the fragile paper with archival gloves. When they left, the apartment felt cavernously empty. The physical weight was gone, but the moral weight remained, now shared with an organization halfway across the world. The absence of the diamonds, however, did not solve the problem of her siblings. Liam, true to his word, had started to apply pressure. A letter arrived from a lawyer she had never heard of, a sleek, corporate firm whose letterhead screamed expense and aggression. The letter was polite but firm, formally requesting an inventory of their grandfather's personal effects and a full accounting of any items of value discovered therein. It mentioned the accordion by name. It was a clear legal threat, a warning shot. Alara knew Liam was behind it. He was trying to intimidate her, to force her hand. She forwarded the letter to Dr. Schmidt, who assured her their own legal team would handle it. This is not uncommon, Ms. Gallo, Dr. Schmidt had said over the phone. When large, unclaimed assets surface, claimants often appear. It is unfortunate, but predictable. Do not speak with them or their lawyers. Let us handle all communication. But the legal pressure was only one front of their attack. The personal one was far more painful. Chloe began a campaign of emotional warfare. She left long, tearful voicemails, accusing Alara of destroying the family, of being selfish and paranoid. Grandpa would be so ashamed of you, she'd cried in one message. Hiding things from us, your own blood. We're supposed to be a team, the words hurt, but Alara held firm. Their definition of family and team seemed to be based on shared financial gain, and she wanted no part of it. The real turning point, the moment that elevated the conflict from a family squabble to a genuine moral crisis, came about a month later. Dr. Schmidt called her, her voice unusually grave. Alara, she said, forgoing her usual formality. We have made a significant breakthrough. Our genealogical team has been working on the Levi, jeweler, Amsterdam line from your grandfather's note. As you discovered, Jacob Levi and his immediate family were murdered. We could find no direct descendants, no surviving children or grandchildren. Alara's heart sank. So it's a dead end? No, Dr. Schmidt said. and the word was heavy with implication. Not a dead end. We found a living relative. A great-nephew. His name is Samuel Levi. He is 87 years old. He survived the camps as a child. He now lives in a small, state-funded retirement home. In your city, Alara was speechless. In her city, a living link to the diamonds, to the ghosts, was breathing the same air she was, just a few miles away. He is their heir, Dr. Schmidt continued, the rightful heir to his great-uncle's fortune. We have not contacted him yet. We wanted to speak with you first. This changes things. This makes the abstract real, the abstract real. Samuel Levi, a man who had endured the worst of humanity, living out his final years in modest obscurity, while the immense legacy of his family was hidden in an accordion, then behind a row of books, and now in a vault in Geneva. The time for research and secrecy was over. The story was no longer about the past. It was about the present. It was about an old man in a retirement home. I have to meet him, Alara said, the words coming out before she had even consciously formed the thought. It was an undeniable, gut-level imperative. She had to see the face of the man to whom this incredible debt was owed. She needed to look him in the eye and, in some small way, complete the journey her grandfather had started. It was a journey that would force her to confront the true meaning of inheritance, not as a matter of wealth or property, but of justice, memory, and human connection. The retirement home was a modest brick building on a quiet, tree-lined street, the kind of place you could drive by 1,000 times without ever truly seeing. It was clean and orderly, but had an air of quiet resignation, of lives winding down in faded floral armchairs. As Alara walked through the automatic doors, the scent of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables filled her nostrils. She had spoken with Dr. Schmidt and the project's legal team at length. They had advised caution, arranging the meeting through the home's administration without revealing its true nature, simply stating it was regarding a family historical matter. They were worried about shocking the old man, about the legal complexities. But Alara had insisted. This couldn't be a transaction handled by lawyers. It had to be human. She found Samuel Levi in the communal sunroom, sitting by a large window overlooking a small, meticulously kept garden. He was a small, frail man, his hands, liver-spotted and trembling slightly, resting on the handle of a simple wooden cane. He wore a worn cardigan despite the warmth of the room, and his eyes, behind thick glasses, were a pale, watery blue. They held a profound and ancient sadness, the look of a man who had seen too much and had been looking at the ghosts of it ever since. She introduced herself simply as Alara Gallo. She did not mention the diamonds. Not yet. She sat down in the chair opposite him, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. My grandfather was Dominic Gallo, she began, her voice soft. He came to America from Italy after the war. At the mention of the war, a flicker of something shifted in Samuel's gaze. It was not fear, but a deep, weary recognition. The members of a club no one ever wanted to join. I am an archivist, Alara continued, trying to find the right words. My work is to piece together stories from the past. My grandfather left me something of an old accordion, and inside he left a note, a list of names he wanted to be remembered. She watched his face carefully. He remained impassive, his expression unreadable. He had likely built walls around his heart a long time ago, thick and high, to protect what little was left inside. One of the names on that list, Alara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was Levi. From Amsterdam, Samuel's hands tightened on his cane. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a crack in the wall. He did not speak, but his pale blue eyes were fixed on hers, suddenly sharp and piercing. He was listening. He was waiting. He wrote about a jeweler named Jacob Levi, she said, her own voice thick with emotion. His family, his wife, Rachel. His daughters, Sarah and Hannah. She spoke their names. Names she had learned from the archives. Names that had haunted her dreams. At the sound of the little girls' names, Samuel Levi finally broke. A single tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. He took a shaky breath, the sound a ragged, painful thing. "They were my cousins," he whispered, his voice raspy with disuse and memory. She was only 6. She had hair the color of honey. The wall had crumbled. He was no longer a frail old man in a retirement home. He was a boy again, a boy who had lost everything. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a lifetime of questions. Why? Why did your grandfather have their names? And so, in the quiet sunroom, surrounded by the mundane routines of the end of life, Alara told him the story. She told him about the accordion, about the false bellows, about the discovery. She spoke of the diamonds not as a treasure, but as a burden, a heavy collection of memories her grandfather had carried in silence. She told him what the project's researchers had pieced together. Dominic, a young anti-fascist partisan in northern Italy, had been part of an underground network. He was a courier. The accordion was his cover. He moved valuables for families trying to escape or trying to hide their assets from the Nazis. The Becker collection, the Levi diamonds, the Rosenberg assets, they were all part of a final, desperate shipment he was supposed to guide over the Swiss border. But something had gone wrong. The network was betrayed. Dominic was the only one who had escaped the raid. He had fled with the accordion, the last known keeper of a fortune that belonged to ghosts. He had failed in his mission to get it to safety, and the guilt of that failure, the weight of the souls attached to the diamonds, had silenced him for the rest of his life. As she spoke, Samuel listened, his gaze never leaving her face. He wept silently, not for the lost fortune, but for the story itself, for the confirmation that his family had not just vanished but had been fought for, that their memory had been carried, however secretly, by a stranger for over 70 years. When she finished, a long silence settled between them. "All these years," Samuel said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I thought no one was left to even remember their names. I am the last." He looked out the window at the garden, at the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the grass. "The money, the diamonds, they mean nothing to me. I am an old man. What would I do with a king's ransom? But the story, that your grandfather carried this, that he never forgot, that is the true treasure." The meeting changed everything for Alara. The diamonds were no longer a historical problem to be solved by an institution in Geneva. They were connected to this man, this gentle, grieving survivor. The moral imperative was now deeply personal. When she informed Dr. Schmidt of the meeting, the legal machinery of the Inheritance Reclamation Project, which had been moving with deliberate, cautious speed, accelerated. Samuel Levi was confirmed as the sole surviving heir of the Levi assets. The process of repatriation began. But it was not simple. News of a massive, long-lost Holocaust-era asset being claimed does not stay quiet for long. A lawyer representing a distant, previously unknown cousin of the Rosenbergs materialized. A European museum put in a claim for a portion of the collection, arguing it was part of a state-seized treasure. And then, inevitably, Liam and Chloe launched their own legal assault. Their lawyer filed a motion claiming that any assets found among their grandfather's effects belonged to his estate, to be divided equally among his heirs. Their petition painted Alara as a disturbed, unstable woman who had stolen family property and was concocting a wild, unbelievable story to keep it for herself. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was Samuel Levi, the Inheritance Reclamation Project, and Alara, fighting for historical justice. On the other was a coalition of greed, opportunists, institutions, and her own family, all circling, their eyes on the glittering prize. The diamonds, once a secret, were now the subject of court filings and legal threats, their cold light illuminating the very worst of human nature. Alara found herself at the center of a storm, her quiet life as an archivist utterly destroyed. She was no longer just the keeper of a story. She was its defender. The legal battle was a brutal, soul-crushing affair. It was fought not in sunlit rooms of quiet remembrance, but in the cold, sterile language of depositions, affidavits, and motions to dismiss. Alara's life became a blur of meetings with the project's lawyers, of preparing testimony, of seeing her grandfather's memory and her own character dissected and maligned in official documents. Her sibling's lawsuit was the most vicious. Their lawyers portrayed Dominic Gallo not as a partisan hero, but as a wartime opportunist, a thief who had stolen the diamonds for himself. They painted Alara as a deluded accomplice to his 70-year-old crime, someone who was now trying to give away their rightful inheritance to a stranger. They demanded a full share of the assets. Alara had to face Liam and Chloe during a deposition. The meeting took place in a soulless conference room with a long, polished table that felt a mile wide. Her siblings sat on the opposite side with their lawyer, their faces hard and unfamiliar. They looked at her not as a sister, but as an obstacle. Liam, in his perfectly tailored suit, spoke in calm, measured tones, accusing her of being sentimental and financially irresponsible. "Our grandfather was a simple man," he stated to the court reporter. "He worked with his hands. This story of him being some kind of secret agent is a fantasy Alara has constructed. The simplest explanation is the most likely one. He found these diamonds and kept them. They were his. Now they are ours." Chloe was even more cutting. She questioned Alara's mental stability, her reclusive lifestyle, her obsession with the past. "She lives in a world of books and dead people," Chloe said, her voice dripping with pity. "She doesn't understand the value of money or what this could do for our family." For her own future, Alara sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and listened to them tear her life apart. The pain was immense, a deep, physical ache in her chest. They were not just fighting for money. They were actively trying to erase the truth, to rewrite their grandfather's story into one that suited their own greed. But as she listened, a strange thing happened. The pain began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. They were wrong, and she had the proof. The project's lawyers were magnificent. They were not just legal experts, they were historians and advocates. They presented the evidence Alara had painstakingly gathered, the cross-referenced names, the deportation records, the testimonies of other partisans from the same region of Italy. They presented Dominic's own words. "Forgive me. Remember them." They asked Liam a simple question. "If your grandfather intended for you to have this fortune, why did he hide it so completely? Why did he leave a list of its original owners? Why did he write, 'Forgive me'?" Liam had no answer. He could only stammer about his grandfather being old and confused. The other claims were eventually dealt with through negotiation and historical proof. The museum's claim was dismissed when it was proven their records were inaccurate. The distant Rosenberg cousin was found to have a legitimate, though small, claim, which the project agreed to honor. But Liam and Chloe would not back down. Their case went to a private arbitration. The final confrontation was not with lawyers, but with her siblings directly. The arbitrator, a retired judge, suggested they meet one last time, without legal counsel present, to see if any common ground could be found. They met in the same sterile office where the will had been read, the place where it had all begun. This time, there was no pretense of family affection. The air was thick with resentment and anger. "This is your last chance, Alara," Liam began, his voice tight. "Drop this fantasy. Agree to a settlement. We can all walk away with more money than we could ever dream of. Don't throw it all away for a story." "It's not a story," Alara said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "It's the truth, and it's not our money to take. It's a pile of shiny rocks that was in our grandfather's possession." Chloe burst out, her composure finally cracking. "That makes it ours. Why do you care more about some stranger than your own family?" "Because he is not a stranger," Alara replied, looking directly at her sister. "His name is Samuel Levi. I've met him. I've sat with him. I've listened to him talk about his 6-year-old cousin, Hannah, who was murdered. These shiny rocks are all that is left of her. They are her memory. They are his." She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was the picture from the archive of Jacob Levi's smiling family. She slid it across the table. "This is who you are stealing from." Liam and Chloe glanced at the photograph, then quickly looked away, as if the image might burn them. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, of shame, crossed their faces. "This has nothing to do with us," Liam muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It has everything to do with us. Alara said, her voice rising with a passion she didn't know she possessed. It's about who we are. Grandpa spent his entire life carrying this. He couldn't fix what was broken, but he saved the pieces. He saved their names. He passed that responsibility to me, and I am not going to fail him. I will not let his legacy be one of greed. I will not let our family name be attached to theft. She stood up, her small frame radiating a strength that seemed to fill the room. You can continue with this lawsuit. You can try to take this money, but you will lose. And even if you won, you would have to live with what you've done. You would have to know that you chose money over justice, over memory, over the very soul of our family. I will not let you do that. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving them sitting in silence with the photograph of the smiling, doomed family between them. She didn't look back. She didn't know if her words had reached them, if they were capable of understanding. But it no longer mattered. She had made her choice. She had defended the story. She had spoken for the ghosts. And in doing so, she had finally, truly, found her own voice. The arbitrator ruled against them a week later. The judgment was unequivocal. The assets were to be transferred to the Inheritance Reclamation Project to be distributed to the rightful heirs. Liam and Chloe were left with nothing but their lawyers' bills and the ashes of their greed. Alara never heard from them again. The final chapter of the story unfolded not with a dramatic courtroom victory, but with a series of quiet, profoundly meaningful acts. With the legal challenges resolved, the Inheritance Reclamation Project could finally complete its mission. The diamonds were carefully and ethically liquidated through a trusted international consortium, the process overseen by a panel of historians and financial experts to ensure absolute transparency. The final sum, after all expenses, was even greater than the initial estimate, totaling just over $300 million. A foundation was established in the names of the families on Dominic's list, the Levi Rosenberg Becker Memorial Fund. Its purpose was twofold. First, to provide for the living. Samuel Levi, who had asked for nothing, was given a trust that would ensure his comfort and care for the rest of his days. He moved out of the state-run facility and into a beautiful small apartment with a garden, tended to by a full-time caregiver. Alara visited him often. They would sit and talk for hours, not about the money, but about his family, about his childhood in Amsterdam, about the memory of his cousin Hannah's laughter. Through her, his past was given a voice. Through him, her present was given a profound sense of purpose. The distant Rosenberg relatives were also found and compensated, their lives changed by a legacy they never knew existed. The second purpose of the foundation was to honor the dead. Following the model of the Becker family's quiet resistance, the fund was dedicated to supporting education, sponsoring historical research into the Holocaust, and funding programs that fought intolerance and hatred around the world. The diamonds, once a symbol of stolen lives, were transformed into a source of hope and understanding. They were no longer a burden, but a beacon. Alara was asked to sit on the foundation's board of directors. She refused any salary, agreeing only to serve as the keeper of its story, the archival conscience of its mission. Her life returned to a version of what it was before, yet it was irrevocably changed. She still lived in her small apartment, still worked at the library. But the quiet solitude of her life was no longer laced with loneliness. It was filled with a deep, resonant purpose. She had been entrusted with a great weight, and she had carried it to its proper destination. The one thing she asked for, the only piece of the inheritance she wanted, was the accordion. Mr. Abram, who had followed the story with quiet, knowing pride, had lovingly restored it. He repaired the cracked wood, replaced the yellowed keys, and, most importantly, he built it a new set of bellows. They were beautiful, crafted from fine Moroccan leather, and they were light, airy, and empty. They were designed to hold nothing but air and music. He refused any payment for his work. To have touched such a story, he told her, is payment enough. One cool autumn evening, Alara sat in her living room, the newly restored accordion resting in her lap. The space where the diamonds had once been piled on the floor was now just a simple rug. The weight on her shoulder was gone. She looked at the instrument. It was no longer a container for a secret, a vessel of guilt and memory. It was just an accordion again. Her fingers, hesitant at first, found the keys. She remembered the simple, mournful tune her grandfather used to play, the one that had always sounded so sad. She began to play. The notes filled the small apartment, the new Bellows breathing easily, freely. The sound was rich and clear, a chord of both sorrow and release. She played for her grandfather, Dominic, the silent courier who had done the best he could. She played for Jacob and Rachel Levi, and for their daughters Sarah and Hannah. She played for the book-loving Rosenbergs and the brave Beckers. She played for Samuel, in his new apartment with the sunlit garden. The music was still sad, for the story it told was one of immeasurable loss. But it was no longer a sound of suffocated grief. It was a song of remembrance, of justice finally served, of a promise finally kept. The melody flowed out of her open window and into the quiet city night, a story not of a vast fortune, but of a single, priceless legacy of moral courage. Alara Gallo, the quiet archivist, the keeper of other people's stories, had finally found the ending to her own. And it was more beautiful and more valuable than any diamond. She had inherited not a fortune, but a responsibility, and in fulfilling it, she had become the wealthiest person she knew.